British novel. The questions I think we need to ask here are, what is the novel? Where does it come from? Why did it appear in England when it did? And what did it do when it arrived? Now, there are many answers to these questions, and none of them are as innocent as they appear. I'll suggest some preliminary answers here, but we'll work over parts of these questions. Most pressingly, I think, what does the novella do in every lecture? Here are the easiest answers. First, the novel is a long prose work of fiction, which has in-depth characterization, intricate plotting, and a finely drawn, which is to say realistic, fictional world. The novel arrived or was created in England around 1740, when Samuel Richardson wrote Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, a novel in letters about a virtuous serving maid who refuses to give in to her employer's sexual advances and eventually marries him, thus becoming a lady of standing. The most famous answer to the question of why the novel appeared when it did comes from Ian Watt's The Rise of the Novel, published in 1957, and the most groundbreaking account of what the novel was doing. Watt claims that the rise of the novel is coincident with the rise of individualism in philosophy and the rise of the middle classes in England. Because England was industrially ahead of other countries, its nascent middle class had time and literacy to read novels. They wanted to read a form that was inexpensive, easy, and reflected their experience of themselves as particular individuals. Now, many critics have revised Watt, naturally. Feminist critics have pointed out that Watt's theory only addresses class, and it largely leaves out gender. Watt's not really able to say why so many early novels focused on women and were written by women. One such revision of Watt is Nancy Armstrong's Desire in Domestic Fiction, published in 1987, so 30 years after Watt, and it basically turns around Watt's thesis. She claims that representations of middle-class life and values actually preceded the world that they described. By allowing the middle classes to imagine themselves in their world, the novel then actually calls into being that world. As this theory goes, early novels focused on women because middle-class values were defined and propagated in the representation of women and in what they called the private sphere. Novels, then, that seemed anything but political, novels of love and romance, novels, for example, like the ones Jane Austen would publish, were in fact political operatives, and they enabled the middle classes to gain moral hegemony in England, over and against the values of the aristocracy. More recent critics yet, like Catherine Gallagher and William Warner, have pointed out that before the novel could become English, it had to forget that it had once been French, and Spanish, and Italian, and other things. Rather than creating the novel then, Richardson in 1740 borrowed a form that was already in use by various sources: scandal sheets, French romances, and illicit narratives of sexual adventure. English novelists had to make that sexy French pedigree legitimate and English, and largely male, in order to get to the canon that we now know: Richardson, Fielding, Smollett, and Sterne. What all of this tells us is that the history of the novel is not the smooth, triumphant rise to power we once thought it was. It's also the history of a programmatic forgetting, a living down and a denial of certain ties, including ties to the more scandalous but just as influential female authors of the 18th century. Among them, Sarah Fielding, Charlotte Lennox, Elizabeth Inchbald, and the wonderful Frances Burney. Next section, the novel and the polite lady novelist. The middle-class culture that came to dominate Britain by the end of the 18th century imagined itself as existing in two complementary but separate spheres. The public sphere belonged to men. It was the sphere of business and money-making, of politics and empire building, of industry and struggle. And the private sphere was considered to be feminine. It was the space of home and hearth, of sympathy and nurture, of simple piety and child-rearing. For a woman to be involved with the commerce of the public sphere was to be unsexed by her connection to the world of men. Now, we might well want to ask, what of writing?